Highly questionable experimentation on human embryos led to the birth of genetically altered twin sisters in China. Chinese scientist He Jiankui claimed to have done this to protect the children from HIV. He announced his experiments in a series of YouTube videos in which he attempts an ethical reasoning. By making this version of the story public before he even notified his own institute, he obviously tried to frame the following discussion in his favor. Now that the scientific community finally has received more information and has had the opportunity to respond, it comes to light that not only was the experiment ethically wrong, and it was illegal, but it was also scientifically unjustified. Which means that even in the best of outcomes, he could not have achieved what he claimed. After an appearance at a conference in Hong Kong, he went missing, and it still seems to be unclear where he is. In this episode, we will try to recapitulate and discuss what He Jiankui did, the many ways his experiment was wrong, and the responses in the scientific community around the world. I said try because there is a long list of things to be discussed, and we probably will run out of time. My co-host is Bart Gurten, and I am your host, Dennis Eckmeyer, and you're listening to episode 16 of the Science for Societal Progress podcast. Hey Bart, how are you doing?
I'm pretty tired. It's 4 weeks of teaching now, and yesterday I finally gave my last course until Christmas break.
Yeah, you were pretty hard to reach last week.
Yeah, that's true. I'm very sorry to the members meeting where I couldn't come over, but my wife said, here are the kids, go grocery shopping, I see you in 8 hours. Fair enough.
2 courses at the same time, that's crazy. I thought there was only 1 course. I think I missed that part.
So like the last week were 2 courses at the same time because tragically one of our colleagues died in beginning of November. And so I asked my PhD students if they would be happy to assist me. And luckily Robert Kossen managed to do a whole calcium imaging course on himself.
Wow.
My people are awesome, to say the least. May I have time for a short announcement? My student Chrissy Cotta will have defended already when this podcast goes live, and I'm just very proud that she is now done with everything, and I'm looking really forward to her disputation.
Yeah, fantastic. Last episode we were talking about genetic modification in the last Bart and Dennis talking episode. In the last episode, we were talking about animal welfare and animal experimentation and why human experimentation is unethical. So I think that these 2 things come together nicely in today's topic, because last month there was a human experimentation experiment was announced by He Jiankui. He's a geneticist in the field of genetic alteration of human embryos, and they are basically doing research on how to do these genetic alterations. But the field overall says that they're actually not at the point where you can do that safely. But for these experiments, what they do is take embryos from couples that are undergoing in vitro fertilization, or at least this is how I understand it. And in the in vitro fertilization process, they usually produce larger amounts of embryos to test the embryos and see if they have maybe genetic markers for genetic disease or something. And then they choose 2 healthy or several healthy embryos for implantation into the becoming mother. And for research purposes, some of the other embryos can be used. And I think that's what they do the genetic alterations on. And these embryos are never implanted. They just go up to a certain number of cells, and then they do genetic testing, and then they know if their experiment worked or not. He Jiankui actually implanted 2 of the altered embryos into a woman. That was so he says he did that with the consent of the couple. He wasn't licensed to implant altered embryos and have the mother carry them to term. And it would be illegal, and the scientific community says it's unethical, mostly because CRISPR-Cas9 is not perfect enough yet to be considered safe for doing these things in humans. In the GMO episode, we talked about possible side effects where you can hit the wrong target, so-called off-target effects. And then in this study, he had several couples where the father is HIV positive and the mother isn't. And he altered several embryos and tested, I think, one cell. So he did single cell sequencing, as it's said. So they take one cell and sequence it, the DNA in it, and see what happened. And for one couple, he then implanted the embryo. And the gene that he altered was the CCR5 gene, which in a certain mutation, it's implicated in HIV resistance. But it's also implicated in influenza vulnerability and West Nile virus vulnerability. There is the possibility of cognitive enhancement, and overall, we actually don't know a lot about this gene that he altered.
That seems quite a diverse gene with quite a number of diverse functions. The cognitive one is at least surprising. Is it clear how aware the parents were of the risks and problems that might arise from this gene editing?
Yeah, this is the big question. So in the show notes to this episode, there is a link to an article for The Atlantic by Ed Yong. According to this article, he was not trained to gather consent from patients.
I've no whatsoever clue about human experiments. So there's a special guy in the hospital that's coming down. If I now come to university, medical school, and I have to get some treatment, and they want to do an experimental treatment with me, there will be a special person coming to me to get my consent for the experimental treatment.
Yes. Yeah, and they need to be trained, as far as I understand, to do it in the right way to make sure that the consent is 100% clean.
So that I understand every aspect of the risk that I'm going to take.
Yes. Yeah.
And He didn't do that properly, is the claim of the Atlantic article.
Yeah, he used the wrong form, maybe. I'm pretty sure it's not just the form. I could imagine that you also have to be trained personally in talking to people so that you don't influence their decision in the way you talk to them. Yeah.
It might already be unethical for the experimenter that wants to do the experiment to actually get the consent because he might be influential to the patient.
Yeah, exactly. I could imagine that if it's the experimenter himself, that could be a problem. I don't know exactly the procedure that is in place. It appears that he was not skilled to do it. Maybe he wasn't even eligible because he was himself doing the experiment. There is a talk that is also linked in the show notes. That is his talk at the Human Genome Editing Summit in Hong Kong, which he gave after this was released.
Mm-hmm. You mean with released, he already released a paper and it's published?
It's not published. It's not peer-reviewed. The release was a series of YouTube videos.
Oh.
The links are out. I know.
That sounds super scientific to me.
Right, yeah. So it's also in the show notes.
Why not do major scientific breakthrough and use the same channel the Marvel Cinematic Universe uses to actually teaser their films?
Yeah, it's super fishy. I mean, that is something that people do who want to influence the public in their favor because they already know that the scientific community will not agree.
You mean like twittering Third World War tweets instead of like going through the normal diplomatic channels?
Yeah, for example.
So the release that you were talking about is really a series of YouTube videos instead of like a real scientific publication or anything in
Right.
that.
And in these YouTube videos, it's really mostly about ethics. So it's not very technical. He explains some of why he chose this specific gene, but he does not really explain the experiment. It's not like a scientific publication. It's really addressing the general public with an ethical discussion about his experiment. And it appears that it's actually contradictory to what he has voiced. That's what it says in the article.
What I find quite telling in this article is that he seemingly also didn't tell his own institution that he's doing these experiments. That actually already shows that he not felt quite comfortable with doing them.
I also think that it has to do with the law, that the law here actually agrees with the ethical agreement among scientists that human embryos should not be genetically modified.
Is this also the case for China? I have no idea about Chinese law.
That's how I understand it, yes.
Now, all ethics aside, what was the scientific outcome then? Did these kids actually get the genetic modifications that were planned for them?
No. So what he was trying to do was to take the CCR5 allele that they had and change it into a different version, Delta 32. This version is found in about 10% of Europeans, and it's implicated to be involved in immunity to HIV. Now, first of all, this doesn't seem to be a complete resistance. It's incomplete. And also, he did not actually change the gene to that version. It appears that he created new mutations that we don't actually know what they will do. And also, he did not change all alleles. So each gene show up in the genome several times. And if you don't change all of them, all of the occurrences, then the people might not get the phenotype that you're looking for. So in this case, there's a so-called mosaic expression on one hand. So some cells will express the original genes and some cells would express the mutated gene. And the other thing, it would be heterozygous, where all cells would express both genes. Does that lead to HIV resilience? I don't know. Apparently, the experts, as cited in the article, also don't know. And I mean, this is a completely premature experiment. So first of all, the CCR5 gene is involved in many different functions. The Delta R32 mutation, we don't really know what it does. Some of the downsides of the Delta 32 might be that the people are more vulnerable to influenza, so the flu virus or the West Nile virus.
But at the moment, nobody can tell whatever happened to these kids, can they?
Right. So far, they seem to be healthy, but they're just babies. They think they were born, I don't know, mid 2018. So they've been born a while ago. They have been waiting to see how they're doing before they announce what they did to the kids. But they're still very young.
But from the parents' point of view, I can imagine if I would be HIV positive and somebody would tell me, this is a good way how you protect your kid from being HIV positive, then I would take that chance, wouldn't I? But
so,
would that mutation really help them? So would I give my kids HIV via in vitro fertilization?
In vitro fertilization, or IVF, there is a way to actually clean the HIV out of the ejaculate so that it does not, it cannot enter the embryo.
So there was no medical need for me to get gene modification to my kids.
Oh, not at that point. No, definitely not. You could then say, oh, but later in life, they might get in contact with the blood of the father, or might contract HIV in a different way. And he's not talking just about physical harm, like the AIDS illness, but he's also or AIDS disease. But he's also talking about the social discrimination that they might face. But there are a lot of ways how to avoid HIV infection that are pretty safe taken all together. And the experts say that engineering people to be resistant to HIV is not the way to go. It's that there are so many ways to not contract HIV just by having safer sex, I guess, and wearing gloves when you're in contact with somebody else's blood, etc.
Taking again a lot of ethical issues aside and saying, well, seemingly the parents might not have been able to give consent. This didn't really work, and on top of that, there was no medical need for this experiment at all. If now Hay returns to the scene and tries to publish that, would you publish this as a publisher?
So, there is so what comes with publishing is actually an ethical evaluation. So you have to show and present to the publisher usually that you have the ethical so that all the ethical agreements are in order. So you must have to abide to ethical standards. I think it's mostly.
You're a vertebrate scientist.
I'm a vertebrate scientist. Yes.
You were a vertebrate scientist, are a vertebrate scientist. So one of the important guys. So how was your work checked?
Well,
on ethics.
It's still animal research, right? It's still not human research. So our ethics part is that we state that the animal experiments were conducted according to the law and the statutes of the institute.
Okay, that's what we also always have to sign, and which we abide to. But if one of you listeners are actually working on humans or with human tissue, you might give us some insight into the process of ethical decision making in human science. I would be very interested if there is really like a test of the publisher, like let's say an esteemed publisher as Elsevier, roughly testing the ethical questions that come from one of their papers. On the other hand, what I always find a bit complicated is, okay, I see that there is this appeal to do unethical science to gain an audience, and seemingly this is an important thing here, because Hay had this I think he even had a PR guy working for him and did this YouTube videos before he went through the proper scientific process, before he even told his own institution. That all is, to me, very very shady. And now, what do we do with the data that he produced? Are we going to like throw it away and say this is unethical, can't be published, and we don't want scientists to do unethical things? Or do we keep the data and actually say, anyhow, how this has come to that, we might need this data to produce better cures for human society?
So in general, I would say no, we should not use it. If you do that, right, you say oh yeah, he did this terrible experiment and he will never be able to work in science again, but we still use the data, then his name will still be in the files for being the guy who got these data that are so important in future applications, for example. Like his name will now be the name connected to the first genetic modification in humans, right?
But it always be infamous. If you now, like, as an argument said, okay, this is actually giving him some sort of fame, like scientific recognition, it's still
No,
infamity, isn't
I don't
it?
know. Is it scientific recognition? I'm not so sure. I think it's just fame. People know him.
People also know a lot of German scientists around 33 to 45 that nobody aspires to be.
True, but we know now that it's a way to get into the history books.
Uh, I'd rather be unknown than known for that.
Oh, I agree completely.
If we now would publish that like any other journal paper, I would totally agree with you. Then it would have like there would be some incentive to do the same thing to also be able to publish this
Right.
in that way. But let's say it's put on some data server and just use this data with like sometimes you have also like I think sometimes you have medical data that is just referred to as the patient's data. So like whatever patient R data, where
Hmm.
you don't know like who took it, but you generally use that data. I don't know.
So
This
just
is actually
anonymize the
a
data, put it
case.
in some database, and
Yeah,
of course, nobody knows who did that experiment.
I don't know. I really have. I can't make up my mind here. Maybe this is a case for the humanities.
Maybe we should have a third person here who is like
From the
a
humanities.
philosopher. But then the
Yeah,
episodes will be much longer.
I feel like that this
Yeah.
conversation somehow ends up in some philosophy seminar where somebody says, see, and that's the reason why you study here. These are just bumbling idiots trying to find a solution for something that is solved the following way.
Yeah, I must say, I thought this episode would be smoother, but I'm really stumbling because I realize I know much less about the topic than I need to know.
The major problem is that it's really hard to find hard evidence for the claims that were made in the Atlantic article. Not that they were made up. It's a very good article, but to actually be able to judge if this is an ethical wrong or an ethical foul in some way, I would need more background in ethics, and I would need more background in law, I guess.
Oh, I'm pretty sure that you can trust that uh, overall the scientific community says it's not ethical. The law does not agree with what he did. There is even the rumor that he was put under house arrest by the Chinese government. So he left this human genome editing summit in Hong Kong together with somebody else, and but then later he wasn't seen again.
I think that would be it would be better we if he would be able to speak and able to like defend at least in scientific terms his work so that people can get a more complete picture of what he really did, and just him vanishing leaves a very intransparent situation.
I mean, he vanished after he published his YouTube videos and after he gave a talk at the summit, and these are now public record. So the YouTube videos are still on, and the talk is also on YouTube.
Yeah, but I guess no. I mean, he could just have like cut all communication bases and said, "I want to be left alone," after the feedback he got. But it happened in China, and I don't know.
So what do you think about the comment that is apparently real from an interview with Science that George Church gave? So George Church is a renowned synthetic biologist. He famously is working on the de-extinction of the mammoth project, these kind of things. And apparently he says that there was not much harm done with this experiment.
If the mutation has minor consequences for the individual, I guess maybe there's not much harm done for the two girls. That would be the most important part. I think on a global basis, are we allowed to do human genetics, and are we allowed to edit genes of our offspring? That might have been a huge mistake, because it now built a precedent of human gene editing. I personally find it really hard to define the border where I say this is gene editing for my own benefit, or this is so where to define the border between now I just avoid a genetic dysfunction and where do I actually actively build a new human being?
Currently, there are gene editing therapies where you edit people who are already grown. There were a couple of therapies that made it into the news. It's all still very experimental, but these people were very ill. Usually it's children, very ill, about to die, or with the prospect to die. And they were giving these experimental cures, and the cures are basically gene-edited viruses that more or less repair or genetically engineered viruses that will bring a new piece of DNA into the cells that are affected by the genetic illness. And then the gene can be expressed in these cells, and then the illness goes away. So the healthy gene version will be expressed. And what happens then in this case is that so this is a so-called somatic effect, and it does not affect the germline. And that means that the sperm or eggs that are produced by this individual are not altered, so it will not give the alteration to the next generation. Now, in the case where the alteration is done on an embryo that is just a few cells big, all of the cells are altered, and that automatically includes the germline. In other words, the genetic editing done on these girls will affect their offspring.
Where to then cut the line between gene editing for fashion reasons and for medical reasons, so to speak. And if you could just edit out one gene defect that all of your family had, would you do that? And I guess most people would say, okay, if it's a health issue gene defect that actually threatens the life of my children, why not get rid of it?
Right.
But if it's, for example, a gene that would lead to obesity, then why not cut that as well and help your children to live easier and healthier?
Right.
So again, this seems to be a case for the humanities. There's none here.
Yeah, so the difference is, just to make clear what the ethical difference is, right? In one case, you make the decision for yourself and only for yourself. In the other case, you make the decision for yourself and all of your offspring. And then depending on how the selection process in the future will go, this could affect large proportions of the population in future. Because if you go enough generations into the past, for example, then all of us are related and we share some of the DNA from everybody.
Yeah, I mean, but then it's a rather easy decision, isn't it? Then you should only do somatic engineering with yourself.
Then you condemn every offspring to have to go through the same, probably expensive procedure.
Yeah, but everybody has the freedom to choose then. And who says that this procedure has to be expensive?
True, it might be cheap. Maybe it's on socialized healthcare at some point.
These very, very easy to judge strong cases like your baby dies immediately against like your kid might be obese.
Yeah.
I think your kid might be obese is the genetic ethically discussion that you have to have, while actually the question is your kid dies or not if you change that gene makes a pretty simple case.
Right. I mean, there's also, and we didn't talk about that last time, and I remembered that when I read about the IVF again, and that is that you create several embryos, let them grow to some size where it's feasible, and then you do a sequencing on one or two cells to see if the genome is healthy, and then you select the ones that are healthy or not. This is already, in a way, avoiding genetic illnesses, right?
The question, though, is it unethical or not? As far as I remember the discussion that I had with a friend, if she, for example, found it quite unethical, if you already can see that the kid has some sort of challenge in his life in form of like some handicap that might come up later on, to then pick the kid that is most healthy. On the other hand, I think it's pretty harsh to, in vitro fertilization, give the mother a kid that might not grow to term, because miscarriages are devastating to people.
Yeah.
If I would be a doctor, it would be really, really bad, really complicated decision to actually give a woman a non-healthy child or a non-healthy embryo.
Yeah, I agree.
He's not collecting proper consent from the people, and he's trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. That's like my two major points where I say this is unethical. But let's take one or both off the table, and let's say there would be a special reason for them to have that modification. I don't see a problem that much. Hayes' decision, like from my personal point of view, that was absurd to do that. It's maybe a crime that I can't fathom because I'm not a lawyer, but it's at least unethical. Totally agreed.
Right.
Let's say we create a new situation where this is actually an ethical decision, and that would be something where I can say, none of your kids can grow to term because your genome has this defect and all of the kids will die in the womb. You have no chance to ever have kids, or I go and alter the genome of your sperm.
Right.
Then again, that's the only case where I would see a direct need for a germline modification. And then again, it's so simple that, at least from my point of view, that I would say, yeah, go for it. The only case where I can see a case for germline editing is the patient has a mutation that never will allow him to have kids.
Okay.
One way or another. We forgot one thing. We wanted to write this simple abstract. And as you might have guessed, after my bitching about like lots of teaching, I make it. Dennis was totally capable of doing so, but he took the grace to not let me alone not do it. And so next episode, we are going to present our abstracts. Promise.
Right. Because we totally already chose articles. No, that's fine. We didn't give a deadline, so
Yeah. If listener, you have a paper that we both should look at for like give and don't make it something from astrophysics. That we should look at for like a simple abstract, just write it into the comments and we will pick one of your papers.
yeah, I also think it shouldn't be astrophysics because Bart's wife could help him with that. And that would be an unfair advantage for Bart. So the next episode will be with Dr. Deboki Chakravarti, and she is a PhD in bioengineering who is transitioning to science communication. She's doing an internship at Scientific American, and we talked about how this transition period worked for her. So you will learn how she went about finding a new job, looking for a new job, what the interview process looked like, and what she's now doing in that internship. For the summary and further readings, find the show notes to this episode on www.scienceforprogress.eu. If you have questions, critique, or suggestions, get in contact by email info@scienceforprogress.eu or on social media @Sci4Progress for Twitter and Facebook. Science for Progress is free and accessible. However, in order to keep going and continue to improve and grow, we need your help. You can find information on how to support us on our website if you follow the menu Supporters to Your Support. However, the best way to support us is through Patreon. We are halfway to financing our monthly expenses, and it would be an enormous relief to have that covered. Check out the perks on www.patreon.com/sci4progress. My sincerest thanks to those who are already supporting us. Have a good day. Bye-bye.